Welcome everyone. My name is Darren and I will be your host for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. And I really hope you have a wonderful and insightful time with these 5 amazing panelists and Mike. This event is brought to you by DECODE. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, DECODE is a nonprofit with roots from UC Berkeley and Stanford, and with a mission to decode the future of work for students and alumni. Over the past 5 years, DECODE's annual conferences have hosted numerous notable speakers, including the founder and CEO of Zoom, board member of Tesla and SpaceX, CEO of YC, and CEO of Google X, among many, many others. Our virtual conference last October garnered 1.4 million views across 44 countries, and that prompted us to start hosting virtual events with executives and industry experts like today's session on a regular basis since January. To give you a quick update on our future events, our next session will be on August 11th from 6 to 7 p.m. Pacific time, featuring Michael Lee, VP of Data at Coinbase, the crypto buying and selling platform, which recently underwent an IPO. And we'd really love to see you all there. You can check out our social media channels for more info. And I'm going to quickly attach a link in the chat where you can directly register for the event. Let me do that right now. And so from that event, you can directly register for our next event on August 11th. For any of those who would like to get more involved with us, be it volunteering or discussing potential partnerships, please do email us at join@decode.build. Our network of volunteers and alumni have gone on to renowned companies, including A16Z, Sequoia, YC, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, FANG, ByteDance, and NASA, among others. Now, for today's session, we are super excited to welcome 5 amazing panelists: Felicia Mayo, who is the Chief Talent Diversity and Cultural Officer at Nike and former VP of HR and Head of Diversity at Tesla; Hugh, Molotsi, who is a former VP Innovation and Engineering Fellow at Intuit, as well as a board member of Mozilla; Jamison Hill, a partner at Base 10 Partners; Karla Martin, a Managing Director and lead of the fashion and apparel practice at Deloitte; and last but not least, Promise Phelon, founder and CEO at the Growth Warrior Capital. This session will be moderated by Mike Grandinetti, who is a faculty member at Brown, Harvard, and Rutgers, and one of DECODE's board members. And yeah, we are super excited to welcome these 5 panelists and Mike to share their extraordinary insights on the future of DEI in tech.
Great, Darren, thank you. And welcome everyone on behalf of the DECODE board, on behalf of all of the great team members at DECODE. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to what I hope will be an incredibly informative and rich discussion on a very critically important issue in our time. So we're going to talk in quite a bit of depth tonight about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is pretty unique in that we have 90 minutes to cover this. So we're not going to do a drive-by on this subject because this is not a subject that in any way allows a drive-by. So let me just spend a little bit more time introducing this extraordinary group of panelists. These are leaders, change makers, and path breakers, and all of them have had remarkably interesting careers. So Jamison Hill, undergrad from Harvard. He spent 7 years as a partner at the renowned Bain Capital, and then was recruited to Base 10 Partners specifically to lead just a remarkable initiative called the Advancement Initiative, which we will get into quite a bit of detail on. And I hope it's going to inspire many of you in the audience to go forward and try to bring these exact kinds of programs, to your community. Hugh Molotsi, a longstanding friend and colleague, he came to the US by way of Zambia. He started his academic career in Mississippi, studying as an engineer, came up to Silicon Valley, and he joined Intuit in the Microsoft DOS era. Now, for most of our young audience, they don't even know what that means, okay? And we don't have time to explain it. But what I will tell you is over 22 years, Hugh rose to become the VP of Innovation and an engineering fellow at Intuit. This is the same company that brings you QuickBooks and Quicken and TurboTax and Mint. But Hugh also was instrumental in being one of the key leaders in bringing Lean Startup to the first corporation using that methodology, right? Lean Startup was originally intended by Eric Ries to be used at startups. And Hugh and his boss, Scott Cook, said, you know what, we're building products under uncertainty. Why can't we put this to you? So Hugh's been very deeply involved in the rollout of Lean Startup across the world. He's now on the board of directors of Mozilla, and he is a published author. He wrote The Entrepreneur's Journey. Karla Martin is a double Harvard graduate. She has both her undergraduate and her law degree from Harvard. And she spent the early part of her career as a lawyer and litigator after she clerked for a federal district court judge. She spent 17 years at the iconic consulting firm known as Booz Consulting, formerly known as Booz Allen Hamilton. And she was the first ever Black female partner in Booz. She has a very multidimensional career, but in her current role, she is focused on leading the fashion and apparel practice for Deloitte Consulting out of San Francisco. And a lot of the work she has always done has been around tech, including today, where her work is involved in a lot of digital transformation. Felicia Mayo came to Silicon Valley as a young woman. She has worked for some of the most iconic tech leaders in history. She came out and worked for a gentleman by the name of Tom Siebel. Many of the younger folks in the audience may not know Siebel Systems, but they were the Salesforce.com of their day. And Siebel Systems had one of the highest performing stocks on the New York Stock Exchange throughout the 1990s. So she was then acquired as part of the Oracle acquisition of Siebel, and went on to work under Larry Ellison. She spent a significant amount of time there. And then she did a deep dive on technology working at Juniper, which is an organization that provides routers and switches and communications equipment. And then was recruited to Tesla. So she's now worked for Ellison, Siebel, and Elon Musk, which is quite an extraordinary thing. Very few people probably can say that. So she spent some time at Tesla and then was recruited to one of the most iconic brands on the planet. And she's now running talent diversity and culture at Nike. And last and certainly not least is Promise Phelon. Promise came directly from Dallas, where she joined BEA Systems during the dot-com era. It was a rocket ship ride for 3 years. And after that early baptism into Silicon Valley culture, she spent the last 15 years growing startups, doing turnarounds on startups, mentoring CEOs, and now she's running her own fund and actually finished a recent first close on her fund. So congratulations, Promise, on that. Okay. All right. So tonight, what do we have in store for you? Well, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a phrase that has a tremendous amount of currency. And there's a lot of different discussions we could be having tonight. We're not going to be talking about anything outside of primarily equity and inclusion for Black leaders in big tech, in startups, in professional services, and in consumer brands. And because we have 3 women on the panel, our secondary discussion will be around the inclusion and equity of women. Okay, so that's where we're going to focus all of our time tonight. Now, why are we here? Why did I ask DECODE if I could assemble this amazing group of people? Well, we're going to get into the discussion tonight, but the bottom line is I want to educate and challenge our audience and allow you to have a deeper understanding beyond the superficiality that we often hear about, so that you are no longer, even if you are not aware of it, a part of the problem, but you are now armed with enough insight and information to be a part of the solution. Okay, now I'm going to give you a little history lesson, because I know a lot of Stanford and Berkeley students are not necessarily born and raised in the United States of America. Back in 1776, we had this thing called the Declaration of Independence. And as you can see from the first paragraph, it was quite aspirational. And it said that all men and women, of course, they didn't really think about women back then, but all men and women are created equal. Okay, it hasn't really worked out that way. Now, if we fast forward 200 years, we look at the iconic President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who says that one true measure of a nation in its success is fulfilling a better life for each of its members. That is how we should measure our nation. Well, Inspired by Kennedy and inspired by the leaders of the day, we began to see a variety of different initiatives, including the Freedom Riders movement, beginning in 1961. And then the March on Washington happened in 1963. Martin Luther King, probably the greatest speech given on the United States' soil, his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, okay? And then not that long after, in July of 1964, we saw the enactment of the Civil Rights Act. What you see is the president at the time, the successor to JFK, Lyndon Baines Johnson, shaking hands with Dr. Martin Luther King. And this Civil Rights Act was a landmark piece of legislation that claimed to outlaw discrimination based on race, color, religion, etc., okay, including in hiring. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky, okay? We live in a world with status quo bias. And for a very long time, as a seven-time entrepreneur and longstanding professor of entrepreneurship, I've often gone back to this 500-year-old classic called The Prince by Machiavelli. And what was true in 1513 is true in 2021. There is nothing more difficult to take in hand. There is nothing more perilous to conduct. And there is nothing more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. And Machiavelli continues to say, because basically the old guard wants to keep things the way it's always been because they profit from the way it's always been. Now, the great essayist, novelist, and playwright and intellectual James Baldwin said that it is certain that in any case, that when ignorance is aligned with power, it is the most ferocious enemy that justice can have. And this is Exhibit A for ignorance aligned with power. This is one of the many freedom rides that took place, okay? So the Civil Rights Act and the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech hit a brick wall. And here we are now, 60 years after all of this legislation, 250 years after the passing of the Declaration of Independence. And we're now seeing, maybe for the third or fourth time, corporate America saying diversity is good. Pass the message along. Now, Shireen Mitchell, who is a well-known diversity advocate, says it very well. No matter what diversity initiatives tech companies implement, and by the way, we're going to focus mostly on tech and professional services. Of course, we're going to talk with Felicia about Nike and what's happening. And of course, there's an increasing amount of tech in the world of sports and fitness. But no matter what initiatives companies implement, they have yet to translate quantitatively into both hiring practices and performance. And I can show you a whole bunch of statistics, but this recent Mercer statistic certainly will be more than enough to show you, as we go up the hierarchy from support staff and operations to senior executives, the number of people filling the executive roles becomes increasingly white and male. I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, but as you can see, Black and African American comprises only about 2% of people in senior executive roles, Hispanic and Latino another 3%, okay? And so the purpose of this evening's discussion is, how do we finally get beyond lip service, okay? And so James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed that is not faced. And that's what we intend to do tonight. So sometimes in the winds of change, we find our direction. We have lived through an extraordinary few years, for sure, with everything that we saw around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and I can go on, and Ahmaud Arbery, and what we dealt with in the extraordinary depths of COVID-19, okay? And the world is forever profoundly changed. And hopefully, we will now have a much more effective approach at dealing with diversity, equity, inclusion, and beyond lip service. So this section, I'm going to look to our expert, Karla Martin, I'm sorry, Felicia Mayo, excuse me. So Felicia, who has spent many years within the HR organizations and as chief diversity officer of some of the biggest brands in tech and now in the world in Nike. And she's had a longitudinal view to be able to watch how things have changed. So Felicia, one of the gentlemen I had a privilege of getting to know is a guy by the name of David Casey, who actually runs diversity for CVS. And he spent about 10 years there. He's about to publish a book. And when I asked David, how would you measure performance? What are the key indicators? These are the 4 indicators that he delineated. Workforce representation, and we saw that Mercer demographic a little while ago, but much more importantly, culture of belonging and inclusiveness, equitable access to development opportunities across all groups, and then DEI support for external stakeholders. What would you say might be missing? Is there anything that you would add to David's description of what DEI means for real in an organization today?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for the opportunity to just speak about, a subject matter that I love and live every day. And
my honor, Felicia. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I would actually say, much respect to David and to the areas that he's focused in on. And I think that these are all great areas that I think many of our companies are assessing at all times. We're always reviewing these pieces of data in these particular areas. I would say, for currently where I am, and we're really leading in much of this space right now, as many would say, but when you're in it, you're sweating it and you're not thinking about who's first. I would actually say for the core components that we're looking at, absolutely workforce representation, that is diversity, right? That representation piece, you must have that. That is table stakes. But ultimately, one of the pieces that I think is very important that we are looking at Nike is probably the evolution of my role, the new role that I have, which allows for us to connect not only just DEI alone, but I have talent. And it allows me to look at the end-to-end play of the talent and their evolution throughout their time at Nike. So I no longer really, from my other vantage points when I was at other companies as a DEI or the CDO of the company, I had to go and work with several different individuals, heads of talent acquisition, head of talent management, heads of learning and development. Now they all report into me, along with DEI. So I am able to look at the end-to-end play for talent and pulling the thread of diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the time period of, any talent of any segment, all segments of our company. And that allows me to have the ability to not only see the numbers of representation, but also drive the culture of the company. At the same time, be able to be in the meetings with the leaders to challenge, discuss, integrate into the business DEI, into absolutely everything that we do. So I would say that is probably, from me just looking at this very quickly, maybe the missing piece. And that has been a very pivotal piece to, I think, my success at Nike.
I love it. And Felicia, so what you're saying is you got a kaleidoscopic view, and you also have this longitudinal view where you can see people advancing. You can see whether or not they're being blocked. You can see whether or not they're being given, the proper opportunities to be sponsored. And so it just gives you that much more ability to be effective in your role. Awesome.
Absolutely.
I think I see Miss Martin raising her hand. Hello, Karla. Welcome.
I just wanted to pile on a little bit because I have the pleasure of getting to work with Felicia. And why that is so important is because when people who look like us are in these roles and have talent in their title, we break down this notion that there is a pipeline problem. And we know for a fact from our networks and who we know that there's not a pipeline problem, right? There may be a hiring problem. There may be a how we write the spec problem. That may be a referral of who knows who problem. And so I think this evolution is really revolutionary, right? Because if you decouple DEI and talent, you're constantly trying to convince stakeholders that to do the right thing. When you have talent the way Felicia does, you have no pipeline problem, right? So the numbers coming in, the numbers promoted, who's on deck and who the succession plan is are baked into the plan. And it makes just a huge world of difference, right? I'm fighting for it to change the way we operate within, my super large organization, because it just changes everything from the top to the bottom. So
thank you, Karla. Thank you, Karla. All right, so I'm going to keep going here, right? So now we talk about inclusion and we talk about, Felicia's longitudinal view. And of course, I'm not in any way picking on Pinterest. I could have chosen Amazon. I could have chosen, you name it, Google, right? But I thought that these young women were incredibly articulate. And I really loved how they voiced. So here they are, two young women running social policy at Pinterest, right? And like so many Silicon Valley companies, they claim to be very progressive and very libertarian. And then you have these two talented young women saying, not so much. And so, this quote is powerful to me. When they left, and they left because they were not being treated with any level of equity and inclusion, you're not going to have a more ardent advocate for changing policy than someone who has heard the double talk and seen the marketing while simultaneously experiencing being underpaid, underpromoted, and underappreciated, right? Ouch. So Houston, we have a retention problem too, don't we? Okay. And so one of the questions now then becomes, yes, there's an increase in hiring, but Felicia, to your point, you have the ability to see how the treadmill or the hamster wheel, you're onboarding people, but at the same time, they're going through the revolving door and they're heading across the street or across town, right? And so clearly this is a massive issue. And this is the very heart of inclusion and belonging. What do we need to know? What do all of us in the audience tonight need to know about how we maybe can stop contributing to the attrition problem? Because let's be honest, we all have a role in it.
Yes, we do. We all have a role in it. And, many of the leaders in the company, at least for the company I work for, I'm always sweating that, where I am stating like, hey, because I'm over talent acquisition and I have them like, Harry, bring in the talent. I'm like, wait. What are you doing to keep your talent? How are you retaining your talent? How are you sweating, like having the conversations that, hey, I need you to stay. I want you to stay and here are your career opportunities. And so that is very important that you identify that top talent that you feel should actually stay with the company. You continue to recruit them and re-recruit them because you need. That doesn't stop just because they're with the company. That's number one. Number two, how we all contribute to it is just step back for a second. As you highlighted earlier regarding change, like all of us have gone through massive change in the last year and a half. So, with the pandemic, people have had time to be at home. They have reflected. They have, with the impact of the pandemic, folks have chosen to do many different things that may not have been aligned with what they originally had pre-pandemic. So that is causing a lot of movement and retention or attrition issues as well. And that some of it is very natural as humans, right? We're like, hey, you know what? I just went through something big and I need to shift and do something that I feel like is more purposeful. So in your company, if you're seeing like what we're seeing is much of our talent is choosing what company they want to work for because they are now digging down deep and saying, is this the company that aligns with my purpose in life? Especially when you look at, Gen Z, you look at Gen Alpha and the millennials. They're like, no, I'm calling a thing. Your purpose is not aligned. You've done more talk than anything else, just like your previous slide, and I don't want to be here. And you've seen that with last summer with the tragedy of George Floyd. Black employees are saying, nope, don't want to be here. You've seen it with our Stop Asian Hate campaign. Asians are saying the same thing. And women, are,
Yeah.
you know, have said that for quite a bit of time, and we see that evolution happening as well. So
Yeah,
what I
and even
would say
just yesterday on the news, I'm starting, even just yesterday, electronic arts, right? I mean, just insane in this day and age that it could be that abusive.
correct,
right?
correct. So
Just
what
crazy.
instead of what folks are looking at is, I don't know if you saw the article yesterday, but it was the Great Resignation. That's
Yeah.
the period that we're in. And
Yeah.
so people they're shifting, they're moving. You got to think about in your company, like, what is your purpose? How are you retaining your talent? Because it's your purpose that's going to keep them there. You want their hearts and minds. And before, that was just a cliche. That was something that you said, but it's really about how deep does your purpose go? And now being with a purpose-driven company like Nike, like, we are always looking at how do we have our purpose, how do we make sure not only it rings true externally where you see our wonderful brands, but it must ring true internally. We cannot have a gap between those two areas. So that's how I would say, for the attrition issue.
All right, thank you very much. All right, so now Hugh Molotsi. Most people don't recognize the gentleman in the tie. And I would claim he may be one of the most underappreciated CEOs in the history of Silicon Valley. This is the great Scott Cook, the founder of Intuit. Now, Intuit has won perennial innovation awards because Scott is a gentleman that brings no ego or no swagger to what he does. His organizations are very flat. He was the first CEO in the world to adopt lean startup in a public company. And he's a wonderful human being and an incredibly bright guy. Hugh, you told me a heartwarming story about your very early experience at Intuit. Can you share that with everyone?
Yeah, I'm happy to, Mike. And yes, Scott is somebody I deeply admire. You know, he's the founder of Intuit. And I believe the culture of companies emanates from the personality of their founders. And so, as Mike said, you know, he's a very down-to-earth, humble person, somebody who is very intellectually curious about what people think, what people know that he may not know. And even though, you know, life has, he's had a lot of success in life, you know, for a lot of people who are that successful, what they've learned is that they have all the answers and they tend not to be that interested in what other people think, but just quite the opposite with Scott, which has been quite amazing. And I think the gift of that, of course, is a culture in a company where you have that curiosity, that humility. So I was very blessed to have a long career there. But, you know, regarding the story that Mike mentioned, so when I joined Intuit, was it fairly early days, early enough that every new employee got to have what they called lunch with the dorks. So that was the CEO or somebody on the CEO's direct staff. And it would be about a group of, you know, 8 or 10 employees would get to have lunch with a senior leader. And so when I joined Intuit, and again, this was back in 1993. So thank you, Mike, for outing how old I am.
That's all right. You look marvelous, though, my friend. You've aged well. You look great.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate. I got to have lunch with Scott, and so, you know, we had lunch. You know, again, there were other folks there, but maybe I want to say a couple of weeks later, a month later, I was walking across the parking lot in one direction, and Scott was, you know, pretty far away, but walking in a different direction. But he sees me and recognizes me, and he calls to me. He says, "Oh, Hugh," and then he runs up to me. And so first of all, I'm just amazed that he remembers my name, but he doesn't only remember my name, he remembers what I'm working on. He says, "How are things going on in QuickBooks?" And so, you know, we had a short conversation, but, you know, I was absolutely blown away that he cared. He seemed to genuinely care about me and how I was doing. And again, just the fact that he remembered who I was certainly not something that I expected. So, you know, it's probably no surprise then that I ended up spending 22 years at Intuit, because you know, that ended up being for me a great place, a great culture, and a great place to grow my career.
Yeah, a real servant leader, a real humanist, right? And that's a very important part of belonging, right, and inclusion. You felt like you belonged. So now this is just a generic pipeline. So I heard Karla talk about the pipeline problem in Felicia, and I would say it's a laziness problem, or as you would say, Hugh, maybe it's a credentialing problem. And so you've hired, I can't imagine how many developers and engineers to work for you. And I'm sure, Phoenix Promise has as well. But one of the things that we talked about is there's such an over-credentialing requirement to bring people into the world of software development, right? And so we have to have this 4-year degree, when in fact, a lot of roles within tech do not need a 4-year degree. So whether you go to a community college or whether you go to a coding academy, you're certainly getting the requisite training you need to succeed, at least in early level jobs. So can you talk about that, Hugh? I know that you spoke very passionately to me about this when we prepared for the panel.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I want to say this over credentializing, which I'm not sure is a word, but is not just limited to tech or to software engineering. Yeah. I think it's just we have a benefit where we can actually be much more analytical about it. But I think a lot of different careers have this same problem, which is that, so we go to college and we get degrees, and sometimes we have to get certifications. But if you look at how the job we actually have to do in work, you find that it doesn't draw upon a lot of what we are required to learn. And hence this description of over credentializing. And so how that then ends up tying to diversity and inclusion is because, and I run this problem myself when I took the lead on college recruiting at Intuit, was that, we had a system in place for how we would recruit students. And it was based on a system that we had created when we would only target a small handful of universities. And so when we decided that, okay, look, we have a problem, and yes, we called it a pipeline problem. We said, okay, let's address the pipeline. Let's start to go to different schools. And so we started to cast a wider net. And in fact, I spent a lot of my time at NCA&T. I joined the engineering advisory board, and we saw that as a strategic partner in addressing our pipeline problems. But what was made still difficult from a hiring perspective was realizing that we had put procedures in place that made it very difficult for people who didn't come from what I'll call our traditional sources to make it through the interview pipeline. And so really, and this realization came more in hindsight, especially in the later years when we started to see the rise of these coding boot camps and academies, was realizing that if you're really serious about diversity and inclusion, one of the things you need to take a very hard look at is, okay, one, what are the credentials we really need for the jobs? And by the way, even the jobs that we have done, are these actually the optimal way for us to organize the way we get work done? Are the ways we can get work done differently? And then can that actually allow us to have a much more diverse workforce, not just in terms of how we look, but in terms of our backgrounds and what we bring to the table.
That's great. And Hugh, knowing, you had referred to the sacred cow, if you will, of this small group of schools. How hard was it to get your colleagues to recognize that you needed to kind of break through the boundaries of this very, very exclusive, very small group of elite schools in order to be able to meet the needs of your team and have the kind of diversity that you were looking for? Was that a challenge internally?
It was a challenge because I think for some people they've been brought up to believe that there is a handful of universities that count and the rest that don't. Yeah. I remember a conversation with an executive I won't name because one of the schools that we used to recruit from was Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. Sure. And this person, he came, his alma mater was Duke, and he was complaining that we weren't recruiting from Duke, and he was saying, well, Cal Poly is not even a good school. Right. So,
yeah, right. Yeah, so, right.
So, you know, if you can imagine with that kind of a mindset, then it's going to be much more difficult to get a person like that to think about schools that are maybe not in the top 100 of the US News rankings, or are not, again, traditional, if you think about historically Black colleges and universities. But I would say that, you know, it's mixed. It's a mixed bag. The positive thing is when you find people with a lot more experience, they'll tell you stories of, you know, one of the best people that I worked with, for example, one of the best product managers didn't have an MBA from top business school, or they'll talk about somebody they worked with, and they'll talk about how their different background was actually a positive asset to them. So part of it is just an education piece of it, but yes, it was a challenge.
All right, thank you, Hugh. All right, so Karla, you're up to bat. So Karla, we're going to talk a little bit about Black exceptionalism. And we're going to do the same thing with Jamison, but we're going to talk about, you know, women leaders. So clearly on the left, we have Melody Hobson, who is the co-founder and president of Apparel Investments, an extremely successful financial services asset management firm, but she's on the boards of JP Morgan Chase, the prestigious Rockefeller Foundation. She's the chairwoman of the board of Starbucks. And of course, we have Shelley Archambault, who was the very reason why I was privileged enough to meet Karla for the first time. And by the way, Shelley also introduced me to Promise. So we have these women who are certainly very prominent, but they seem to be getting tapped for all of the board level positions that exist today. And I think, you know, Shelley's a person who is looking to bring her network in and give people a lot more opportunity to participate, right? And then we have maybe the women in the most elite club ever, CEOs of a Fortune 500 company who are women and Black, okay? Ursula Burns, she did an extraordinary job of turning around Xerox. If you've never read the story, right? There's a Harvard business case study about Ursula. She took on a job that nobody else wanted, and she crushed it, okay? And then the woman on the right, the great Rosalind Brewer, who spent early part of her career working in the Walton branded Sam's Club, which was not a positive experience because of a lot of racial threats and death threats to her family for just speaking her truth. Okay, quite extraordinary. She went on to Starbucks as COO, and she was a real pioneer in tying diversity metrics to executive pay. And just recently, in the last few months, she went on to become the CEO of Walgreens. She is the only Black female CEO of an S&P 500 company today, full stop, okay? So board of directors, at least 25% of all S&P 500 companies do not have a single Black or Latino director. 8% of the entire population of all directors in the S&P 500 are Black, okay? And you can count on one hand the number of Black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies in this country. So Karla, I guess you have had an incredible career, okay? And an incredibly diverse career, right? You've seen the professional services industry, working for Booz for 17 years. You became the first Black female partner, right? You spent a lot of time in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. You've been involved in startups, and now you're at Deloitte, right? You've worked with a lot of very senior level executives. I know that you've met very many board-ready Black executives, okay? How do we break through the logjam? How do we turn the tide and make sure that we're able, because again, if we don't have people in the most senior roles, it's going to be very difficult to do it bottoms up, right? So how do we break that logjam?
So I would say two things. I know Ursula well because we've talked about this a fair amount. Yeah. I think the first is like lead with data. Like, so when you talk about over credentializing, every place I've ever worked, I've made it my business to do a study of like who really has these credentials, right? Yeah. So when I graduated from law school and I worked for a Wall Street law firm, and they kept saying like, we hire people who go to the top 5 law schools and they're on law review, which is like the top thing, right? And so I just counted up like that's 20 people per 5 schools. Our incoming class of lawyers was 85, right? Yeah. So either we got all or we didn't get most of them, right?
Right.
And what over-credentializing usually means is every single Black person hits every single one of those metrics. And the white people that are there go to random, like some schools I had never heard of, some, knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody. So
and they read the law review once, right? At some point in their 3 years, they read a law review on it.
It didn't make them bad lawyers, right? So,
right.
But and I think the same is true when Ursula and I talked about being the first Black woman partner. I knew the other Black women who came before me. I wasn't better. I wasn't smarter. I just didn't leave, right?
Yeah.
And part of it was tenacity. Part of it was sponsorship. But absolutely, once I became one, we were done, right?
Yeah.
They got one. It's like Pokemon, and they were, really unwilling to get another. And I think what happens is, and talk to Shelley about this about board, I do tons of work around board readiness, is when it's a risky proposition for search firms when they go to look for board members and they tell the CEO and they have a Black candidate and they present a Felicia Mayo who is more than board ready. The CEO may go, do I have a race problem? Right. Yeah. And if you're a search firm and your velocity and your compensation is based on getting that role filled quickly, you may pull a candidate, right? Because it feels risky. It also is, Shelley will say, you look at the spec of what they're looking for, and it's like, they need to have 22 years in tech. Like, well, we weren't allowed to work in tech for 22 years, or, be left-handed and be able to jump rope backwards. And then you look who actually gets the position, or none of those things, right? And so I think exceptionalism is just a way of saying that we are required to be exceptional, because, and I think the way you break the logjam is what Shelley is doing. Boards are an insider trading game to some extent. If you are on a board, then you call Felicia and go like, we have a seat that's going to come open in a year. And you start prepping that person now. You start getting her to interview. What does her board bio look like? Right. By the time a headhunter calls you, that seat is filled for the most part. Sometimes it's not. And so I think we have to start kind of playing the game of how these things really happen. But also, I just think admitting that we are not, there are 100 and some odd Black people in my graduating class at Harvard, right? Yeah. All of them were not recruited, right? Even when we do, like, I work at a company that all of our assets walk out the door every single day, right? Yeah. And we responded the way all services firm did to George Floyd, which saying like, we're going to go to all the, HBCUs, which are great. We should go everywhere. But what we didn't say is, every school we go to, we are going to interview every single Black person, which would cost us money, by the way. Yeah. And we're already there. And instead, we say that the only place to find Black people are these very specific pools. And when hashtag Me Too happened, no one said we are only going to recruit from Wellesley. Right. We didn't say like that's where all the white women are and we're going to go find them there. They said we are going to do better. Right. But whenever we think about DEI, the very first thing people do is like, we have to go to where Black people congregate in numbers. And that's great. We should always have been going to HBCUs, but we are everywhere that people are. And it's laziness. It's just pure laziness of not looking.
I think laziness is the perfect word to describe the phenomena that you just did. Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Karla. So Hugh, I'm going to go with Jamison now. And Jamison, let's talk about male Black exceptionalism. And of course, the legendary Vernon Jordan, who walked the halls of power through very many different presidential administrations over the course of his illustrious career. And of course, today we have the first ever Black Secretary of Defense, former U.S. military General Commander Lloyd Austin. And then, since so much of our audience is young, let me maybe share some other people that could be considered to be exceptions, right? Virgil Abloh, who just, by the way, sold the majority stake in his company Off-White to LVMH. Quite a remarkable seat of power, the zeitgeist whisperer that he now is. And of course, Tristan Walker, right? But of course, maybe much more relevantly, and today, I don't know if anybody on the panel saw this, but today of all days, and I remember reading about this organization early on, this startup called Squire Technologies. When they first started meeting with investors, the message is, well, you're only targeting Black barbershops in inner cities. We're not really interested. Well, this group has done a remarkable job. So they have raised now a significant amount of capital, and they were brilliant in pivoting during the pandemic. So their business had come grinding to a halt, and they said, okay, so how do we make ourselves relevant when no one's going to the barber? So they created a digital scheduling app, and they started managing payments, and they expect to grow their revenue this year by 300%. They just closed the Series D of 60 million. It tripled their valuation to $750 million. And that's up from just December. So a triple in 9 months, pretty damn good, right? And Tiger Global, many of us think of them as a PE firm, that they've now become the most active VC in the world. They're more active than Andreessen Horowitz. Iconic, which is the notoriously connected family office that was started by Zuckerberg. It's a remarkable story. And then one more before I actually open it up to get some comments from Jamison is another quote unquote exceptional experience is where Vernon, who was a UC Santa Cruz student, dropped out to focus on Realtime. Now, Realtime is a social networking app, sort of kind of like Clubhouse. He's now 23 years old, and he's really one of the first, if not the first, Black CEOs to get a major seed stage funding infusion pre-GA. So he raised $4 million from some pretty well-known names, Alexis Ohanian, obviously far beyond just Reddit, Yancey Strickler, who's the CEO of Kickstarter, which is a certified B Corp, Kevin Lin, C-level exec at Twitch, Ravi Mehta, C-level exec at Tinder. So what's going on here? Are we starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel, Jamison, with some of these stories? Is this a positive sign? Can we expect more of this?
Yeah, no, I mean, so certainly the anecdotes that you highlight are super positive signs. Unfortunately, I just saw an article yesterday that said that in 2020, Black founders and female founders actually received less funding as a percentage of overall venture funding as they did the year prior. Wow. The data points in both directions.
Yeah.
And, this is certainly not a straight line. What we're trying to do with the advancement initiative is very much, I think, address this problem at the root. Yeah. And so just sort of briefly explaining what the advancement initiative is, or unless actually, Mike, you want me to hold it. If it looks like
would you please? Yeah, I definitely want to. I promise you, we're going to get there. That is an incredibly inspirational story. But I do want to talk about, now you're a Harvard graduate, right? You worked at a very prestigious firm as well. You became a partner at Bain Capital, right? That's an incredibly significant role to play in the innovation economy. And I think you have your own views on Black exception, right? And we had talked when we got ready for the panel about this op-ed piece that I read in the Times from Samuel, who, was the first ever Black valedictorian in the history of the 106-year-old history of Oakland Technical High School. And he's going off to Yale. And I love what he said. When the annual news cycle of underdog valedictorians fades, segregated classrooms will continue to endure. And these few heartwarming stories are a distraction from the reality of our education system. I do not want to see yet another inner city success story emerge in my community. I want these stories to be so common they're unworthy of such coverage, right? So what a remarkably eloquent statement from an 18-year-old man, right? So exceptionalism indeed. And so with that, I know you had some thoughts as well, Jamison, about your experience having gone to Harvard and, the world that you've come up in and what that means to you personally.
Yeah, I think I feel very similar to how Karla feels, and really like how she articulated it. I think that when it comes to Black folks in schools, in jobs, people just don't have the same risk appetite. The anecdote that you pull up about Vernon, I think, is a very good one, because there are so many founders who get funded pre-product, pre-revenue, and raise millions of dollars. Very, very few, if any, of those founders are Black. And to me, that's just the perfect illustration of sort of, when thinking about Black candidates, when thinking about Black potential, really sort of feeling like you need credentials or something in order to sort of de-risk it, and just not really being willing to take the same kind of risk that you might take on other candidates who meet 3 out of the 5 of your criteria. But, you say, hey, I know his father, or I know, the club that he was in school, and therefore I'm sort of willing to take this risk. And so, I just feel like you don't get the same opportunities as a result of sort of people's risk appetite and preconceived notions when it comes to Black talent.
Absolutely. And Promise, as someone who has been building companies and hiring, and who has been advising companies and has recently raised a fund, let me get your thoughts on that as well, if I can.
There's so much. I mean,
We got time.
I love what Karla said. So I started my career at BEA. We IPO'd, and then I went through a series of startup companies that I founded to ones I led that were turnarounds, where we had the triple of valuation growth. I've raised a lot of money, and so what I think is I'm sort of looking at this from both perspectives, the perspective of an entrepreneur and a founder, but also as someone who is writing checks now. And I think the word I shared with you is I sort of come with 2 perspectives after having been an operator. Is I think 2 things need to be true. Capital needs to be more than just venture. I see a lot of venture firms say, oh, we've got this initiative where we're carving off, we've got 20 billion under management, and we're going to carve off, 10 million to give to people of color. That money is often not deployed. And if it is deployed, it's deployed in so many small increments that it actually doesn't move the needle. So on one side, you need that venture capital to be what I call mentor capital, where you are actually, if I look at one of my favorite companies is Coinbase. Andreessen Horowitz created a market around that company. We need to do the same thing for companies that are launched by women and people of color. So you have to mentor those entrepreneurs to the place where they know how to create a market around their company and to have the expectation. Today, I met with an entrepreneur and I said, there's got to be part of this. There's pre-seed company. And I said, part of the economics that you're raising, you got to test out different marketing strategies. Right. And they said, oh yeah, we've got that. We're going to spend $10,000 experimenting with X, Y, or Z. And in reality, they should probably spend $2 million. But imagine a person who was raised by a single mother. And if you take the entire generation, they don't have $2 million of net worth. Right. And to say you should experiment with that, there's a level of conditioning required for that entrepreneur to even think in that mindset.
That is anyway near sufficient enough. Absolutely.
Exactly. And so I'm not angry. I think that, 2 things have to happen. You need investors who look like Jamison, and you need people opening doors like Felicia and Karla so that you can mentor people and condition them and give them the capital. But on the other hand, you need the Bumbles.
Yes, absolutely.
That have won through arbitrage, right? Who've actually created markets and who've been successful so that investors can see a new pattern. And once you have both of those that are happening in a harmonic, I think then you create change, but it's not sustainable for a venture firm to write $250,000 checks and expect that that is the deed. It needs
it's
to
a
be
self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It really
you need
is.
an actual wave. What I'm saying is you need a harmonic. You need the people getting mentored and conditioned, and you need the successes so we all see a new pattern happening.
Yeah, and I have used the mentor capital phrase for a long time. I think it's very powerful. I think in many ways, it's one of the most valuable currencies that you can bring to early stage, entrepreneurs, whether they be young or first timers. Absolutely. Thank you. So now let's talk a little bit about the advancement initiative, but let me set this up. So remember, historically Black colleges and universities emerged around 1865 at the end of the Civil War, right? At a time when at Tuskegee, they actually had to build their campus before they could go to school, okay? They actually had to forge the bricks and build the building so they could actually go and attend their university, okay? What I have often heard, and what I believe to be true, is that HBCUs uniquely are able to meet Black students, underrepresented students, where they are. And it goes back to Promise's point. A lot of these young men and women may come from single families. They have a lot of economic hardships. They're not sure from semester to semester if they're going to be able to come back. So they're under an incredible amount of stress. And because of their ability to support students where they are, if you come in to an HBCU when you want to get a STEM degree, they're going to help you get through the program one way or the other. So one of the statistics that I think is remarkable is Dillard only has about 300 students. Dillard is in New Orleans. They have 300 students. They graduated 13 physics bachelor's degrees last year. Harvard graduated 1. Because what happens at Harvard is if you're not really doing well in physics, and let's be clear, physics is not, basket weaving. It takes a lot of discipline. You need people to get you through that program. And if you're feeling as if you're under supported, you may wind up, falling on another major. So HBCUs are clearly a national treasure, a remarkable number of very prominent alumni, just a few who are named here. Now, because they are so great at STEM, I think that, I remember reading an article about this advancement initiative, and Jamison was quoted, and I think I was calling him within 5 minutes. I was so inspired by it. So Jamison, if you would be so kind to describe this incredible, forward-looking, iconoclastic initiative that drew you from Bain Capital to lead it.
Yeah, happy to. So, the genesis of the advancement initiative, I think, really came about coming out of last summer with a lot of founders asking myself, asking other Black venture capitalists, horrified by what they were seeing with Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, wanting sort of a way of both publicly supporting communities of color and then also actually moving the needle on diversity within their own employee base. And so when we went away, we did a bunch of thinking around how can we actually sort of attack the root of inequality. And unsurprisingly, within a capitalist context, that answer comes back to capital and access to capital. And that we have a bunch of communities, mainly communities of color, who have suffered from a lack of access to capital for decades. And that compounds in a really profound way to kind of lead us to where we are today. So we started with this goal of how do we get capital to communities of color that need it? What would be the most effective, high leverage institutions that we could support that would effectively do that? And we very quickly came to historically Black colleges and universities. When we actually dug into the numbers, we sort of, had this feeling that relative to their peer set, they had fewer resources. We didn't really realize the scale. So just to give you a sense, a non-HBCU on average has $410,000 in their endowment. An HBCU has $15,000 per student. And so that's a nearly 30x difference. And when you sort of think about that, it reverberates throughout the entire institution. So labs, libraries, scholarships, financial aid, career preparation services. So, if you think about interviewing for a job as an engineer at Google, and you're competing with someone who maybe went to Harvard and had their Office of Career Services, which is the organization I would say entirely responsible for me landing my first position out of undergrad. Yeah. It's a completely unlevel playing field. Yeah. So it's our hope through the advancement initiative to actually close that endowment gap that I mentioned. And the way that we do that from a specific sort of mechanical way is that we've raised about $300 million from a combination of HBCUs and other universities, pension funds, endowments. And we donate we invest that in late stage companies. And so we have a portfolio of about 12 right now that include some of the leading, tech companies in the world. We're lucky enough to partner with the Figma, Attentive, Brex, Plaid, Aurora Solar, Circle CI, Nubank.
Wow. So these are all in the growth. These are all in the advancement fund.
These are all in the advancement fund. And what we do then once we exit those companies is donate 50% of our carry. So what our fee would have been to the schools that we partnered with as LPs in the initiative. And the sort of, point is very much to get real dollars to these schools and grow their endowments, but then also to be able to, over the next, decade, be able to introduce them to other managers, have them be big participants in the ecosystem, because ultimately at the top of the venture ecosystem sit LPs who have a tremendous amount of influence over venture funds, who gets funding from a venture perspective, which ultimately translates down into who gets funding at an entrepreneur level.
Jamison, it is brilliant. It is inspiring. And I pray that many other firms, funds, emulate what you've done.
Thank you.
It's just a remarkable thing. And I wish you all the luck in the world with it, because to me, I remember when Karla and I first talked, one of the things that she mentioned to me was, helping young people of color pay for their educations, right? So that you wipe away debt will give them so many more choices as they come out of university. So what a brilliantly, visionary move. I just love it. All right. And again, just for everyone's benefit on the, in the audience tonight, right? If you're thinking about where you may donate, right? And overcome this insanely small, just embarrassingly small amount of endowment money per student, is we have about 100 HBCUs in the country. Enrollment has been declining at about 1.5% a year. So we're now at the lowest enrollment in the last 20 years. We've already lost 6 of these HBCUs, right, with all of the incredible heritage and all of the value that they bring. Another 5 or 10 are considered to be financially in danger today. And not any different than any other industry, for lack of a better word, right? We have the haves and the have-nots. So we have a few like Spelman and Morehouse and Hampton who have received, have been the sort of disproportionately beneficiary of a lot of the money that's been pouring into these HBCUs. And they're starting entrepreneurship programs, which is great, right? It goes back to what Promise had mentioned, right? I mean, the earlier we can start to train young men and women in entrepreneurship, the more effective they're going to be as they start their own companies. But clearly this is a national treasure that needs to be nurtured, needs to be protected, needs to be funded. Okay. All right. So now we have Promise, and Promise, we've got, what I loved when we talked, and we've talked a couple of times as we've gotten ready, right? You want to be certainly a role model and a mentor, and you want people sitting on the other side of the table to feel comfortable that they understand that, they can someday grow up to be Promise Phelon, or the male version of Promise Phelon, right? They want to be able to feel comfortable that there is an opportunity for them to grow and thrive in the world of entrepreneurship and the world of venture capital. Now, let's be clear, you are fighting a good fight, because as we look at the VC industry, the demographics of VC partners is no different than the demographics of senior executives in Fortune 500 companies. 3% of all VC partners are Black. And Jamison mentioned, and this is really troubling and surprising, that the capital allocation to Black founders actually went down in 2021. Wow, that's not what I would have expected. But still, this is, that's why what this entrepreneur told you today is, I've got $10,000 to experiment, because 1.5% of all venture capital allocation goes to Black founders. And Black female founders, of course, as you would very well know, face the most significant obstacles, right? 2/3 have to bootstrap. And what I find amazing is the average female founder raises a seed round that is roughly 5% of average. So you tell me if you think these numbers are accurate, but from what I saw, this is the Diane Project. And the Diane Project is tracking both Black and Latina founders. And they're saying the median seed round for Black women is 125K, 5% of the average national, or the median seed round nationally. And for Latinas, it's not that much higher. It's about 7.5%. Does that jive with your understanding, Promise?
Yeah. Yes. I think there is a problem.
That is an understatement, but yes, there is. And you're in Dallas. When say Dallas, there is a problem, right?
There's an opportunity. I think, I got lucky, actually. So when I got to BEA, the CEO was a mentor of mine. There were a lot of leaders who were mentors of mine. Bill Campbell became a mentor of mine. Shelley Archambault became a mentor of mine. Brad Smith is who Felicia knows. So I have been extremely fortunate in getting the mentorship, and I've also worked really hard. And I'm a little distracted because one of the things that's been on my mind today as a woman of color is what's happened with Simone Biles and the Olympics. And I just had a daughter, and I recorded a video for her. She, of course, doesn't know what that looks like or what that means. She's 6 months old, so I have to put this in a vault somewhere with my cryptocurrency. But what I told her in the video was that it's hard out there for a woman of color. Yeah. Because there is this exceptionalism. Yes. You are judged not based on your being, but on your doing. And so performance is part of how you get love and acceptance. And so what that creates and generates in you is someone who works really hard to fit within a very small aperture of emotions, of possibility. And so, Karla being out there, Felicia being out there, Jamison being out there, it isn't enough. We actually have to get comfortable mentoring and raising up what I believe is one of the most responsible cohorts of Americans, Black women. They exist and they operate on a shoestring. They raise more children alone. They work hard. They build companies. And so I want to back responsible people who are economically responsible with my LP's money because I need to get returns. This is not charity. And so what I feel, I guess, called to with my fund is, first of all, I have a return expectation, and I'm a fiduciary, but I also feel called to recruit people who look like you, people who look like Felicia, people who look like Karla, Jamison, Hugh, to feel comfortable with their biases to raise up and support folks who don't look like them, because we've got to change this. How do you have an economy that only grows based on a contribution of a small number of people? So I feel it's an imperative for us.
I look and Karla, I see, I promise you're going to come to you in a sec, but all I would say, Premise, is I look at a country like Japan, where a woman could study engineering, but then she's a coffee girl, right? The privilege she has of getting an engineering degree is she gets to get coffee for the men, right? So you look at a country like Japan that has suffered economically. They have been in an economic malaise for 30 years. Half of their workforce or prospective workforce doesn't work or barely works, right? They're not getting anywhere near the productivity and the brain power and the creativity and the energy from women. It's insanity, right? And we're guilty as charged as well, maybe not quite as bad. but we've been edging slowly towards something a little bit more inclusive, but we're still in the third inning at this point. Karla, please, you had your hand up.
So what Promise said spoke to me because I have two daughters and a son.
Yeah.
They're teenagers, so I could talk to them directly.
Yes.
And I did talk to them because I said the biggest privilege that I hope for my children is the right to fail at something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And particularly in venture capital, like when I was at Google, when I, was helping people receive rounds, like Black founders don't get to fail, right? The number of white founders who get at bats over and over and over again is order of magnitude, right? And if you take Black women, it's almost zero, right? It's Promise that like two other people she could call on the phone right now. And so Simone Biles on the large stage is exactly what that feels like to all of us, right? Because every mistake is amplified, right? You just don't, and everybody fails. Everybody falls down, right? Everybody, it's how you learn, it's how you get better. But that is the epitome of privilege, is that you just never get to fail, right? And that's because of that, the idea of taking risks, the cost of every risk is just higher. It's higher for every Black woman because the cost of failure doesn't hurt just me. It hurts Promise. It hurts Promise's daughter. Because when somebody washes out of every company I've ever been to, we have to have a conversation around, is our DEI, is it working, right? We fire white people every day, and we don't say, is it working? Is it working for these people? Every time somebody is not doing well and they're Black, we talk about the entire program, right? And the amount of pressure that puts on young professionals and senior professionals to constantly be watching each other and making sure that we're fitting in the parameters of what Promise calls this little tiny box is just huge.
Yeah, Karla, it's such a powerful thing that you shared, right? And of course, you both have been mentored and are colleagues of Shelley, and there's an incredible Harvard Business School case about Shelley. And Shelley herself went into a turnaround, just like Promise has. And it's very clear in the case that Shelley felt like she had zero safety net under her, okay? She had only one choice, and that was to succeed. And even when she was given coaching from Brad Horowitz, that maybe you shouldn't take this job because it's impossible. And then after she took the job, to say, maybe you should shut it down, to say, no, I ain't putting up the white flag for no one, right? I totally get it. And I have to say, when Miss Osaka, withdrew from the French Open, she got criticized quite a bit. But I do think, and obviously it was amazing to see every single national, and even the BBC, one of their lead news stories was about Simone Biles, right? I thought she handled it with incredible class and grace. And I also think that, all the news stories I have heard have been very supportive of her. Right. And I don't know if you would agree with me or not. But that being said, I certainly understand exactly what Promise and Karla are saying. Right. And I can imagine the weight of the world on her shoulders when she made that.
I'd love to just opine for one moment, and I'd be curious to hear what Felicia says, because certainly the system owns responsibility for some of what's happening. But as an African-American woman, I also feel that I own my own conditioning. And so what I would say about what Simone did, the other part of it, is she showed up with a level of sovereignty that I found remarkable. So the last sentence of my video to my daughter was, Tula, get your paper. So that you can decide. Right. And you can weather and you can fund your decisions and you can be sovereign. And so, I guess, Felicia, I'm curious to get your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so as you can imagine, watching all of this unfold, right? Especially this week and even before, watching a vice president, Kamala Harris, have to check every box. And to your point, Promise, and also to Karla, get your paper. Get your paper so that it gets you there. I mean, I am sitting here reflecting on when I was in tech. And I mean, literally, I think because I was the only one sitting in the room, or in the boardroom, if you will, at the time, it was kind of like, oh, well, and we were talking about HBCUs and talking about why specifically Black employees would not want to come to the West Coast. So it was almost as if I was not even sitting there as a Black woman. And it was like, oh, but you didn't, but you're not from the East Coast, because the premise was, oh, we're never going to be able to get engineers to come from like NC State. And it really wasn't even about NC State. It was HBCUs at the time, because I went to NC State. That's why that's on top of mind for me. But it was like North Carolina A&T. Like, we're not going to be able to get them to come out because, the family, they're connected to the family, and they never would want to come out to the West Coast. And like, there was a whole long narrative. And I let the narrative play out. And I sat there because I wanted to hear it. Not because I wanted to be quiet. I wanted to hear what the narrative was. And then at that point, I was able to say, hey, I have something to say and to share here. Yeah. And I said, your narrative is incorrect. I want to be real clear. While I didn't go to an HBCU, I actually am from the East Coast. I am from the South. I'm from the Bible Belt, from North Carolina. My entire family is still sitting on the East Coast, and I'm here. I have been here for X number of years. And so to be able to have that and unfold it in front of those executives that were sitting there that actually said, Felicia, she wouldn't know about that. She went to NC State. She wouldn't know about the HBCUs, and she's not connected. But I think that I tell that story because you're right, Promise. Like, we as Black women, we have a lot, and I'm sure other women have, there are different nuances, right? But specifically, as we talk about the Black female, there's a lot that is packaged there. You are correct. We have done a lot historically for the country. We have done a lot that no one even knows, because we have many unseen heroes and unknown heroes every day. I think with Simone Biles, I mean, I'm not speaking on behalf of Nike at this point, because Simone is not one of our athletes, but if just looking at her as a Black woman and making a very difficult choice and being able to be comfortable in who she is and herself, I think that's something that Karla and Promise and myself and any other woman of color actually has to be okay with, and making decisions every day in corporate.
I love it. All right, guys, I love the discussion. I'm going to push us forward because we're starting to run out of time, right? So I don't think anybody's going to disagree with this statement. And I do love this quote from Joseph Heller. You may or may not know Joseph. He's in Southern California. He runs a startup known as The Studio, and an important part of what they do is they connect businesses to Chinese manufacturing, although I suspect that will be coming to an end soon, given everything that's happening on the geopolitical front. But I think access to entrepreneurship and capital is the next civil rights movement. And I think in many ways, many of you have articulated that. Now, what we haven't spoken about is Hugh is 5 years into his new startup called Ujamaa. So, Hugh is an entrepreneur who has, come out of a large public company. Jamison has been funding entrepreneurs now for 8 years. Promise was an entrepreneur and a turnaround specialist, and now funding entrepreneurs. And this is right. This is a very important part of economic inclusion. And so, regardless of whether anybody in their soul believes it's their moral imperative to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion, let's be very clear, it is irrational to ignore the economic benefits. Okay, so if you like the color, if you're not fond of the color brown or black, but you like the color green, then this message is for you. Okay, companies with below average diversity scores versus companies with above average diversity scores, from a fairly credible source, the Boston Consulting Group, says that 45% of all companies with above average diversity scores, they reported much higher levels of revenue. And then, let's talk about a competitive advantage. And of course, the incredible Usain Bolt, that in his prime, he was always 3 steps ahead of the pack, right? 35% more likely to have financial returns above industry average, according to McKinsey. 75% more likely to have ideas actually become productized because you get that diversity of perspective and that creative tension. 70% more likely to capture new markets because you get innovative, creative thinking, okay? And the Center for Talent and Innovation is the source for those last two statistics. So the bottom line is we've had a lot of lip service, but it feels like, and this is what I want to check in with the panel, it feels like maybe after 60 years of people not really hearing, maybe some people are starting to try to be a part of the solution. BlackRock, right, the largest asset manager on the planet with over $1 trillion under management, has taken a pretty aggressive stance. They have voted against the re-election of 1,862 directors at 975 companies due to a lack of board diversity. And they're not a rubber stamp. They've only backed 1/3 of all social and governance proposals in 2020. Now, what people may not know about BlackRock is they are the juggernaut. If you look at this statistics, BlackRock is one of the top 3 investors of 97% of all real estate companies, 96% of all utilities companies, 93% of IT. So they are the 800-pound gorilla in the capital markets. And they are really putting their money where their mouth is. And I want to get the perspective of our panelists in a second. And then on the opposite side of the country, we have CalPERS, right? One of the largest pension funds in the country. And we've got Samiso, who's running corporate governance, and he's echoing what I said, diverse teams outperform operationally, from an innovation point of view, financially. And so they're pushing very hard for new ways to assess performance. And what's amazing to me, and Felicia, I'm going to check in with you on this as soon as I finish this next slide or two. The change in the S&P 500 has been a step function. In 2018, only 10 S&P 500 companies were linking performance on DEI to compensation in the exec suite. That number doubled to a still embarrassing 20. But in 2020, there was quite a step function to about 1/3, and I imagine that will only increase. And so guess what? Nike, right? And you speak to this, of course, because this is your world. From what I've read, and you can confirm, right? You're setting some pretty aggressive targets that by 2025, you want to have 30% of the people on the team and that are, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and 45% are now women. And you're tying it directly to executive pay. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, is this going to be helpful? Is this real, or is this magic? Is this smoke and mirrors? And I'm not asking about Nike. I'm asking about the S&P 500 ties to diversity, and is BlackRock and CalPERS, are they really going to make a difference here?
Well, first and foremost, let me just speak to Nike. Let me just say, I will tell you, it's not smoke and mirrors. We're looking at systemic solutions overall. And our targets are set. We are pretty aggressive in our targets, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we are not just throwing numbers or darts, at the board here. That we are, like some of the companies we've seen, and I will say that from just my area of expertise, not again for Nike, but we've seen it, and I'm like, there's no way. But at Nike, we are really going deep. We're really making sure that from those targets, and that's 2 of the targets that we have, but we have, I think the most important is where you started today, Mike, which is education. Like, we have to make sure that our leaders are educated on what is diversity. What is equity and what is inclusion? And I know, we had at one point years ago, unconscious bias, and everybody was doing unconscious bias training. Okay, that was like, check the box. And we still have unconscious bias training, but what we have done has been, and we have it on our targets as well, in our impact report, is our education is through Northwestern University for all of our leaders. And that has been something industry leading, where it is not just a 1-hour class, it is a class, it's a semester of training, and you get grades and you got to write papers and all of that. So imagine all of the lovely insights that I got from everyone as soon as they found out it was real. But what was most important is that systemic solution. First,
Yeah.
we can hit targets all day. We can hit targets and we'll keep churning through the talent. My concern is I want you educated as a leader because I don't want you to churn through the talent. I want you to understand how to have discussions with that talent. I want you to understand what some of the challenges are to be able to know, like, hey, this is not a challenge. This is not a concern. It is more of a concern on my part as their leader to help make sure that I'm given the resources and the opportunities to move forward. So that's number one. I think the other part is, Mike, in the last year and a half, what I have encountered at Nike, and I've heard from several folks out in the industry, ESG, like we are being held, like that is a real thing. I am on more ESG calls than I've ever been in my entire career. I am, like, myself and my sustainability partner, which we head up Purpose. We are talking to all of our shareholders. We are in meetings. We are talking to them all together. We're talking to them individually. They're asking us questions. So it is a real thing, and we're going really deep. And I think that, you know, the difference between what it was years ago to what it is today is today you need to have that, not just one click down. You need to have 5 to 10 clicks down in the targets that you have, or you're going to be called out on your bluff. Before, you could actually have no clicks down, and you just actually gave money, and you can actually, now those companies, you know, you can see those companies, you know, when you're reading about them in the magazines on like if they have a click down or not, and employees sniff it out as well. So it does hit your bottom line on the diversity that you have within your company, for sure.
That's awesome. All right, I'm going to keep running. So on Karla, I'm going to ask you, since you work in another Big Four consultancy, right? We had spoke briefly about E&Y creating some internal policies about, you know, do I have what it takes to get promoted, and some of the criteria for promotion within E&Y have been, you know, very specific. So what are your thoughts on this? Is this something that you think is sustainable over time? The fact that you can only get promoted if you demonstrate a tangible ability to attract diverse talent, sponsor professionals, etc.
So I can't speak for E&Y, but
I understand. I don't want to ask you.
I can speak for Deloitte, and to some extent, you know, the good thing about being a Black woman partner in the consulting firm is I know the other 7 across the industry, so we talk all the time. I think what has changed has been, you know, I would say what I used to be was the Thurgood Marshall seat, right? So our numbers stayed constant, as Felicia would say, because if we lost one, we replaced one, right? That is not DE&I, right? And so that is just saying that we can keep our numbers constant by replacing people. And what we're starting to do is say, you know, what does it mean to have a career here? And what does it mean to sponsor a career here? And it's been very hard, right? Because we don't have any Black people on our board, right? You know, as we were trying to do DEI consulting work with white people, you know, talking to increasingly Black leaders about how they could do better, right? It's not a good look. And so I think what is different now is, to Felicia's point back at the beginning, I think everybody had a year. I think Black people in particular had a real year, and the young people and the Gen Xers and the millennials and the 20-year-olds who come to work now expect better. They demand more. They're holding us accountable. They vote with their feet. And, you know, we are starting to make it part of, you know, how you get paid. And I think what the hold the feet to the fire for big firms is, the broader you make it, it will become, you know, the net beneficiaries historically of affirmative action have been white men and white women, right? And the net beneficiaries of things like, you know, DEI could do that as well, unless you demand that it be about race. And I think one of the biggest things that I keep pulling back from is, if you roll it up into a big umbrella term, and I love purpose and I love sustainability and ESG, you make it harder to have a conversation about race. And for big companies, this is a conversation that it starts and ends with race.
Yeah.
And we have to keep our feet to the fire that it's easy to build a diverse environment. It's very hard to build an inclusive environment. And the further you are out from the mean, the harder it is to build a career, right? So I think, talk to me in 5 years.
Yeah.
And I think it's companies like Nike who are saying like that percentage point from 27 to 30 is meaningful. If they had said we're going to like 50%, I'd be like, bye, Felicia. But that 3% is hard work, right? It means that people have to stay and get promoted and be on boards. And, the small number of seats at the top have to be left open, but for, and that is the hard work of DE&I.
Thank you, Karla. So we have run out of time, but I'm going to race through a few slides and then we're going to wrap this up. Again, going back to the importance of inclusion and the importance of education. Some of you may have heard about Alt Finance. This was a program that came together with the leadership of the Wharton School, and they are focusing specifically on private equity and alt credit investing. And it's a combination of scholarships, mentorship, and a virtual institute. And the content that is being created is either going to infuse those HBCUs that have a B school, or it's going to be brand new content for those without. Both Apollo, Oaktree, and Aris are contributing a total of $90 million over 10 years. And the pilots will be with Clark, Atlanta, Morehouse, and Spelman. And then for more traditional finance, of course, we have Black Pathways, which is under the auspices of JP Morgan Chase, that has been an incredibly active supporter, having pledged $30 billion to racial equity, setting the bar incredibly high. And then I want to just ask Jamison and Promise, right? We've got the Transparent Collective that is trying to, very much like an HBCU, it's trying to meet Black founders where they are. They have graduated 52 founders. They have helped them raise $42 million to date. We've got the Diane Initiative. And again, this may not be consistent with what Jamison has seen, but Black female founders, the number of $1 million deals has increased by 4x over the last couple of years. And the cumulative raise has gone up by $2 billion over the last couple of years. Now, this is coming directly from this group. Jamison and/or Promise, do you have any thoughts on this? Is this consistent with what you understand to be true?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, the venture market has just grown. This is, largely, I think, reflective. The numbers I was citing earlier were sort of as a percentage of total funding. And so certainly, it is great to see this improvement. But again, as we look at the total market, we're not actually seeing much movement. And it's interesting. I mean, even when you look at female GPs at firms, there was a period from, call it like 1998 to 2008, where the percentage of female GPs stayed pretty constant, 8%. And so, we're working with such small numbers here that it's exciting to see growth like this. But I think it's important to keep it in context. Venture as an asset class has grown tremendously.
Absolutely. Especially with all the PE firms coming in. And the hedge funds and the mutual funds. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right. So as we race to the finish here, so let me ask everyone, if you would, just to wrap this up, and you've been awesome. I'm going to ask Hugh, starting with you, if you could, just if you would impart on our audience just one thought, one recommendation that would help our audience become more a part of the solution, either something they should start to do that they've not done, something they should stop doing yesterday, or something they should continue to do. And I'm going to ask each of you just one recommendation, one suggestion to our audience as to how we can, better help work together as a society to make our world more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive. What would it be?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I think what I would implore people to do is, step off the sidelines.
Yeah.
I have 2 teenage daughters now, and I'm finding they're increasingly becoming more militant than I am. And so I'm trying to
God bless them, Hugh. God bless them. Yeah.
I try to caution them about using the R word inappropriately. And I actually say there is a word that, or a term that I feel like is very insightful, which is anti-racist, you know. And so I feel like you can use that, and it's less charged, and really it's saying to people, what are you doing? If you are anti-racist, how are you then essentially stepping off the sidelines and helping? And so that's what I implore people to do, is ready to get educated and to be active and play a role.
Thank you so much, Hugh. I appreciate it. Karla?
So I will quote Arthur Ashe: start where you are. Use what you have, do what you can is always, you know, the best way to wake up and do every day. Stop thinking that you're not part of the problem, regardless of where you sit. You are part of the problem and part of the solution. And, you know, I think just continue, right? I think the hardest thing every day is to just get up and start all over again, right? And our family this last year, which was really hard, we would go to bed at night like the Waltons, which ages me a lot. And we just like, tomorrow is another chance to do better, right? Because we would have days where I have teenage daughters too. We're screaming at each other, right? We're locked in together. And, you know, just continue, just keep going, right? It gets better, right? You know, it gets better slowly and then all at once, but only if you just keep going.
Yeah, that tipping point. Absolutely. All right. Thank you. Jamison.
Yeah, you've got to change the incentive structure. And so, you know, the world exists as it does today because incentives, the system is designed with a set of incentives that, you know, work for the people at the top. And so, you know, for sort of the generation of venture capitalists ahead of me, they have made a bunch of money backing teams of, you know, 2 white guys from Stanford. They're going to keep doing that. Like, there's no incentive truly for them to change, you know, sort of beyond paying lip service. And I even divorce it a little bit from morality or ethics or anything. It's just sort of like, hey, when I wake up in the morning and I've got, you know, the 5 most important things that I've got to do in the day, like, I'm going to do those things that I know are high ROI. And so, you know, certainly through our advancement initiative, you know, we're trying to change a set of incentives to change, you know, a particular system. But I would think about it in sort of, you know, every discipline and every workplace that you have, you know, the more that you can tie diversity, inclusion, you know, important goals to compensation, to other incentives, to actually getting capital, if it's from, you know, an asset allocator like BlackRock, I think that's what's needed to really drive transformational change.
Okay. Thank you, Jamison. Felicia?
Yeah, I would say start focusing in on systemic solutions through and make sure your actions are linked to that. Really looking at like the deeper solve versus just kind of the top of the waterline, if you will, not the top. You want to go all the way down into the base of the issue, just like you would with a business challenge. It is a business challenge, and see it that way. I think the other thing is like, get in the game. Again, to Hugh's point, don't be on the sidelines, like get in the game. This is everyone's game. It's not just one race, one gender, one person, like everyone should be in this game at all times. And just know your purpose. Like you got to know who you are, what you stand for, what you don't stand for, what's right and what's not, and that links to who you are and your purpose. And so you, again, it goes back to systemic. It's deep. It is not just like something you recite. It's not a script. There is no script and there's no playbook. So make sure you are always thinking about what is your playbook, and it might be for that day, for the month, for the quarter, for the year, but make sure you got a playbook. Make sure you got a game plan, especially if you are in the game.
All right, cool. Thank you. And again, promise last and absolutely not least, would love to hear your thoughts. And I'm going to hand this back off.
Follow that up. I have to follow Felicia.
Yeah, you got to. Yeah, it's a tough job. Someone's got to do it, right? Yeah.
Someone come in. You know, I think the audience here are a lot of people who are people who would start companies.
Yes.
And I think, like Hugh and Felicia said, get in the game. Don't start another scooter company. Don't try to be the next snowflake. You know, look at what Squire did. Look at underserved markets. Look at companies like Self Financial out of Austin. Look at Step that just went public recently. Look at companies that are actually getting incredible unicorn level returns that are of underrepresented markets. So whether you're Asian, you're white, you're Latino, whatever, go start companies that go after the tight vertical of underrepresented communities. And so
cool. Love it.
Go build different kinds of unicorns.
I love it. Awesome. Well, listen, all I can say is it has been an honor and a privilege to get to know all of you over the last weeks as we prepared for this panel. And of course, the opportunity to moderate this discussion this evening. You're all remarkable. And I thank you all for being so open and so eloquent and sharing your truths with us. And I want to turn this back now over to Darren and to the DECODE team. And I want to thank them for giving us the space to have this very rich and very deep discussion.
Great work, Mike. Great work.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. Thank you all. And this will conclude tonight's session. Thank you so much to Felicia, Karla, Jamison, Hugh, Promise, and Mike for your time in such an engaging discussion. And thank you all for coming to this really enjoyable session. And I really hope you gain numerous insights from it. We will be publishing a recording of today's session on YouTube. So please subscribe to us on YouTube through this link so you can receive a notification from us when it posts. And we will actually be sending a post-event email eventually, so keep on the lookout for that, detailing what DECODE is more and our YouTube link and future events. And so we hope to see you at our next speaker event, which will be held on August 11 from 6 to 7 Pacific time, featuring Michael Lee, VP of Data at Coinbase. And let me paste in the Eventbrite info again right here. And I really hope you received numerous insights from this amazing group of 5 panelists and Mike. And yeah, we hope to see you at our next event at August 11th. Thank you so much again.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
You can stay behind, but thank you so much for your time, and we hope to see you soon.
Awesome. All right. Nacho! Hey, buddy, you in Singapore?
Yes, of course. Hello.
All right. So listen, I promise you next week, my classes are all over for the summer, and I'm now done with this panel. I promise you next week we will meet, okay? And I look forward to catching up with you. Right?
This is being recorded, Mike.
It's okay. You're my man, right? You're my mentee. We're gonna.